the fourth step that create a surveillance apparatus aimed at ordinary citizens, we have that now. The Washington Post just reported that, you know, when you get on a plane now, not you, but me and other critics of the administration, but maybe you too, because there is no safety in a closing society, no matter what your politics. They're keeping track of what you're reading on the plane and who's sitting next to you and who you're going to go visit and what their phone number is. And in East Germany, a majority of the citizens weren't being watched by the Stasi. Only a minority were. But all it took was knowing that the Stasi were watching you to subdue a whole population. You know, the fifth step is to infiltrate and harass citizen groups, and the ACLU has many lawsuits underway that's happening. So that key part of democracy, being able to gather with your neighbors and say, you know, I'm not happy about the war, I am happy about the war. You know, now there are agents among us watching what we say and what we do. The sixth step is to arbitrarily detain and release citizens. This gets really disturbing because, and again, it's a classic fascist tactic, and I use fascist quite conservatively. I use it according to the dictionary definition of when the state starts to use force against an individual in an effort to close down democratic processes, and we're seeing that. You can't say we're not seeing that if the president can hold you or me in a cell in solitary confinement for months or years. The state has that power now. But I was on the TSA watch list, so that every time I got on a plane, I would get this quadruple S security clearance, a security warning on my ticket. And finally I asked this nice young woman who was searching me, you know, why does this keep happening? And she said, you're on the list. And I said, the list? And then, you know, I don't think I fit a terrorist profile. And then I started researching it, and it turns out that other people who are on the watch list are Richard Murphy, the great constitutional scholar of Princeton, who had just given a speech being critical of the president's stripping of the Constitution. He had his luggage ransacked, actually destroyed, and he was warned that he was on the list. Two nice middle-aged ladies who publish a news magazine called War Times in San Francisco, they're on the list. One of the senior people at Greenpeace is on the list. Two members of the ACLU staff are on the list. I just got a call from a legal advisor who had been at the Justice Department, who said that she's on the list and that she's on the watch list every time she flies. And she said, I said, what did you do? She said, I told my colleagues, don't torture John Walker Lind and make sure you have a lawyer present when you interrogate him. And she said, I had to do that. I was the ethics advisor. That was my job. I'm a lawyer. And she said they did torture him and they did interrogate him without a lawyer present. And then when I objected, my emails got cleared and there was a criminal investigation against me, she said, and they reported me to the Bar Association, she said. And now she's on the watch list. And I just got another email from David Altoon, who's a senior guy in the military who was critical of the war, and he and his family are on the watch list. So I could keep moving through the last 4 steps, although they're very disturbing, but I think you and I can agree that that is not America.
The book is The End of America. The author is Naomi Wolfe. We'll be right back in 2 minutes. Thank you.
Afterwards and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcasts. Visit booktv.org. More with Naomi Wolfe and Viet Dinh in just a moment.
USA Today correspondent Barbara Slavin says she got the title of her book when an inebriated guest at an event mixed up a common expression. In Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, she chronicles the frequently strained relationship between the American and Iranian governments. Looking at the fall of the Shah, the 1979 hostage situation, and the possibility of Iran's involvement in Iraq after the U.S. invasion, Ms. Slavin attempts to demystify the diplomatic relationship between the two governments. Afterwards, with Barbara Slavin and National Iranian American Council President Trita Parsi, next Sunday, 6 p.m. Eastern and Pacific, only on Book TV.
Afterwards, with Naomi Wolfe and Viet Dinh, continues.
We are back in our afterwards conversation with Naomi Wolfe, the author of The End of America, Letter of Warning to a Young Patriot. Before we left, you were on step 6.
Yeah.
Why don't you go ahead and continue about the rest of the 10 steps
Sure.
that you elucidate in your book?
Thank you so much. So then the next step is to target key individuals. And, you know, this was a very effective tactic that both Mussolini and the National Socialists developed of, for example, Goebbels purged the equivalent of PBS and NPR when he got into power, and then they put pressure on academics in Italy and in Germany at state institutions to coordinate, was the term, with National Socialist ideology, or else they lost their jobs. So people started, key figures in society, and they were usually sort of visible performers, entertainers, editors and journalists, academics, and opposition leaders began to find that they would face first smears, then job reprisals or job loss if they didn't support the regime in question, then increasingly criminal sanctions. They would get caught up in ever-proliferating laws that criminalized speech, for example, and so more and more kinds of speech became criminalized. And finally, they were just rounded up and arrested, which is what would-be despots, as you know, always do. I mean, we're waiting for the shoe to drop in Myanmar for those brave, brave monks to be rounded up and arrested. I mean, the extraordinary courage that they have. You know, we have to ask ourselves, do we have that courage? Because it's time for us to be taken to the streets now, while we're still relatively safe, and not later, as this process unfolds. But so you look at it like Dan Rather, who just filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against his employers because he said that the White House pressured them, Viacom, to dump him, and that's a tactic. It's out of the 50s, certainly, when Senator McCarthy was pressuring CBS to fire people who didn't support the hearings or who were critical of the red baiting hearings. But it's also a tactic from Italy and from Germany. The JAG lawyers, whom I mentioned earlier, they're so brave, these military lawyers who are sworn, as lawyers are, to defend their clients. And they're facing, General Swift had his career derailed because he wouldn't sell out his client. And many people, I just talked to someone, came up to me after a reading yesterday, who works in government, and he said, you know that we have to sign this kind of loyalty oath now. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, there's this, they're basically building a dossier on everyone, and it's like the identity card in Germany. I either sign it and let them go through my banking records and check my credit report and find out everything they need to find out about me, or else I don't have a job and I lose my house. So target key individuals. And you know, I think about even people like Bill Maher, who lost his job. The Dixie Chicks, who had their CDs burned. You know, that scene of people burning CDs. Well, that's right out of Goebbels when he organized spontaneous demonstrations of students to burn books of people who were critical of the regime. Then what starts to happen is that you restrict the press. And you're seeing more and more criminalization of speech in this country, just as you did in Germany in 1931-32, before Hitler was chancellor. And something that's very disturbing is, for instance, Bill Keller, the executive editor of the New York Times. When the Times published the Swift banking story, there was this drumbeat of calls that repeated the talking points: treason, treason, treason. Now, as you know, one penalty for treason is execution. And Melanie Morgan actually said that he should be charged with treason and executed. So since I was reading Stalin at the time, that gave me chills, because I knew that Nikolai Bukharin, who was the publisher of Izvestia, the equivalent of the New York Times, actually was charged by Stalin with treason for criticizing Stalin, and was actually executed for treason. So, you know, I try to be very conservative in my argument. I try to not say, I know who's doing this. But what I think Americans are smart, and there are so many echoes of that kind, of not just tactics from the past, but actual language and imagery and actual replaying of certain key events from the past. You know, 2 or 3 of them is a coincidence, but 30 and 40 and 50 and 60, including language and metaphors, I think that's provocative. And so I'm, very disturbed at the use of the Espionage Act, for instance, the invoking of the Espionage Act. There was this drumbeat of, well, charge him with the Espionage Act. And again, journalists in Washington, when they publish classified material, there are talking points where people say, charge him under the Espionage Act. Very scary, because as you know, but most Americans don't know. The last time the 1917 Espionage Act was used was, in fact, to round up people like, I keep wanting to say you and me, but certainly people like me, activists, people who were, fighting against child labor exploitation, socialists, teachers, anti-war critics, journalists, editors, American citizens, rounding them up without warrants, right, putting them in prison where some of them were beaten. So that's not a happy sign, the invoking of the 1917 Espionage Act. Eugene Debs got a 10-year sentence under the Espionage Act for giving a speech about the Constitution. And the use of the Espionage Act at the end of the teens silenced dissent in America for a decade.